Welcome, guys. This is the Church of the Eternal Logos. This is podcast number 1, and my name is David Patrick Harry, as some of you guys might know. And I'm honored to have a friend and academic colleague in Clifton Huffmaster. Welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So this podcast is the first one, and as you probably already know, we're really interested in logos theology and patristic understandings, esoteric Christianity, mysticism, stuff like that. So this particular podcast, we're going to focus on what is the logos theology, and then some of the academic work Clifton has got into in regards to patristic understandings and analytical philosophy, logical positivism in regards to Wittgenstein's theories. So do you want to introduce yourself, Clifton? Maybe who you are, what your main focuses are in terms of academia and that sort of thing. What got you interested in the things that you study?
Great questions. Thanks, Patrick. So I'm a second-year PhD student at the Graduate Theological Union, and my primary interest is in the early church fathers. And of the early church fathers, I've selected to be kind of my guy, Gregory of Nysa. And of course, I love Gregory of Nysa because he has this beautiful understanding of what it means to transcend reason and understand God actually in the darkness surrounding God. It's this cloud of unknowing. So I really like Gregory of Nysa and his negative theology. And so in order to kind of plumb his depths and come to a better understanding, and also maybe contemporize him to a certain extent, planning on putting century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And to be honest with you, I don't know exactly what they're going to talk about in this conversation, but it's probably going to be something along the lines of what is the ineffable realm. I think both thinkers have a pretty clear delineation between what can be said and thought and that which we must remain silent about. And so to see kind of where they draw those lines, where they limit what we can say and what we can think. I think we're actually going to find my preliminary investigation right now is leading me to think that Gregory of Nyssa actually has a relatively small ineffable realm, essentially consisting of God's essence. Whereas for Wittgenstein, we have a relatively large ineffable realm, probably something, in my opinion, more Kantian. So that's kind of the trajectory of my current research. As I say, I'm not at all an analytic philosopher. I'm really using an analytic philosopher in order to get more deeply into patristic theology.
Mm-hmm. So maybe it'd be helpful for some of the listeners before we really dive into the meat and potatoes of our conversation. It's just like, how do we understand the logos, what the logos is? I'm sure some of the listeners are familiar with John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And but what exactly does that mean to us? What is it? How do we understand that, and how that's going to relate to the conversation? So maybe if you want to say how you think of, or how you define, or even understand the logos, and then I'll try to put in my 2 cents or add to it.
Well, sounds good. I do think that starting with the Gospel of John, especially in a Christian context, is very helpful. But like you said, we don't want to limit it to just that specific word. We have to put it within a huge context. So in the Gospel of John, he begins with, "In the beginning was the Word." And the word that is being translated there is logos. But of course, that word has a huge philosophical history. And we don't have time really, and I don't have the expertise, of course, to really go into all the Greek philosophical understandings of the word logos. But what I can say is when John uses it in the gospel, we have a plethora of definitions that we could use, a translation possibilities. And word is perhaps the weakest, maybe even the worst translation that we could use. Of course, dialogue or conversation would work. Of course, that Greek word can also be translated as reason, wisdom, rationality. And then, of course, one that's often overlooked but very important in Greek philosophy is something like organizing principle, or something that you use to make sense out of something. So I think this organizing or rational principle is another good way to think of logos. Then, of course, there's my favorite, which is, of course, logic. And so I think maybe realize the word logos. However, it's important to realize or remember that in the Gospel of John and Christianity, we're not talking about logic like the rule of the excluded middle, right, or the law of non-contradiction. That's not necessarily the kind of logic that we're talking about. We're talking about divine logic. We're talking about God's logic. We're talking about the logic that is produced from God, that is with God in the beginning. So it's not necessarily a 1 + 1 = 2 kind of logic, perhaps.
Although, so that's interesting because when I think about it, I like to think of logos as language, because I feel language then encapsulates the other adjectives we're using, as in logic and reason and all these things, because those things don't exist without language, and thought doesn't exist without language. So I'm actually fond of the use of word, because for me, word actually encapsulates those understandings. I'm, not that either way is right or wrong, but the way that I like to think about it is, like the word itself. We can't have reason, we can't have logic, we can't have dialogue without language. And what's the atomization of language? It's a single word, right? So, and I think the whole atomization back to Adam and Jesus being I think that this is just a common theme within the schematics of Christianity in general, is like trying to narrow down these hierarchies into these more specific things. But anyways, and then also the logos, even though a lot of the early church fathers understood it this way, they had different interpretations. And I know Psalm 33, I think 33:6 talks about how that God used the logos to create the heavens and the earth. And so then there's discussion in terms of Jesus being the logos, being the incarnation of the logos, but the logos already pre-existing the world itself, creation itself, the universe itself. And then you get into the theological understandings of, well, the logos and Jesus, so because these things are synonymous, is within God, but it's also a delineation, a differentiation of God as well. And I think, and then that's why I like language, because symbolically, we are all, that same process is happening through all of us. We're taking, non-physical, let's associate that symbolically with God, non-physical ideas, passions, expressions, and then we're emanating that into physical reality through vibratory sound waves. So it's becoming physical. And again, and so the incarnation itself is symbolic of the way that people use language. And then what's becoming physical is logic and reason and these ideas and all these things. But that's a great start. And I just wanted to shout out a couple of these early church fathers, of like Ignatius of Antioch. So he was one of the first people to really articulate Jesus as the logos. Outside of the Gospel of John and Revelations and the Greek tradition, Stoicism, which I know that you know a little bit about. That's essential, again, in logos theology within Christianity. I'm pretty fond of Justin Martyr, and the reason I am is because of his how he kind of widens the definition. So for him, Plato and Socrates, they're Christians, not because they believed in in a historical literal interpretation or anything. It's that they were one with the logos. They worshipped, again, this idea of logic and reason and the expression and through language. And then you have Theophilus of Antioch, who again understood Jesus as God, an eternal within God, but then begotten from creation. And then he understood the Holy Spirit as Sophia, and that comes in with these early church theologies, but also Gnosticism, because Gnosticism really tries to articulate this entity called Sophia. And so for him, he understood that as the Holy Spirit. You have Athenagoras of Athens, who was trying to defend Christianity against the attacks that they were atheistic. And the only reason that they claimed Christianity was atheistic is because they wouldn't worship the emperor and the Roman gods, right? And so he gives this whole spiel and presentation about how can we be atheists if we understand God the Father and God the Son, and the Son is the Logos. And then he uses Platonic and Stoic philosophy to articulate those things to everybody. And then Irenaeus, he like Justin Martyr understood essentially all the theophanies of the Old Testament and the New Testament as the Logos, which I think is really interesting because it gives a whole new conception to like the burning bush. Because from Irenaeus and Justin Martyr's perspective, that's Jesus. That's the Logos that's communing to Moses there in the burning bush. It's not necessarily Yahweh. But of course, Jews would have a very different interpretation of that. But do you have anything to say from that before we kind of dive into your work?
Oh man, there's tons of good material in there. One of the things you mentioned that I do think is worth pointing out that I think often gets missed because we do get so zoned in with this Logos theology, looking at the Greek philosophical precedents. And those are certainly important. I'm not downplaying those at all, but patristic scholarship, in my opinion, has really gotten so focused in on the philosophical precedents that we often miss the fact that in the Hebrew Scriptures, being personified, and like you point out, not only do we see creation, the act of creation taking place within or through wisdom. Back in Psalms, we also in the Proverbs see wisdom itself being personified and showing up like an actual person, a woman crying out in the streets. So we have a lot of Jewish and Hebrew precedents for this understanding of God's logic, wisdom, or reason becoming a personality, becoming a person. And like you were saying, that person, of course, is then going to be taking something that is incorporeal and transforming it into something that is bodily. And that, of course, just is, we start to see the hints of the incarnation in the Hebrew Scriptures and in the Greek philosophers as well. So this Logos, especially if we remember it also can mean something like wisdom, then we start to see the Hebrew precedents as well.
Right.
So that's one topic that you brought up that I think was really important. I also just wanted to mention the idea of language and logic. You know, of course, that's something that Wittgenstein talks about a lot.
Exactly.
And I don't want for him to hijack our conversation, of course. And of course, anything that I could say about Wittgenstein would be debatable and contestable because he's a little bit difficult to get your hands around. But I do think it's just kind of an interesting thing to point out when you talked about we can't have logic or reason without language. Maybe. But at the same time, I think it's really important to remember what would language be without logic and reason? It would be nothing without those things too. It'd be babbling or nonsense. So you do need, and that's where the kind of the organizing principle idea comes in, because but then of course all of those things, and that's what makes the concept of logos so impressive and important, is it encapsulates all of those things. It is not just language, but it's also the logic that formulates the language. And it's not just the logic and the language, but it's also the conversation, the discourse. It's the discussion also. It's the back and forth. So there's even perhaps a piece of dialectic idea in the Logos. It's not necessarily just language, but it's also conversation. I think you could see even perhaps in some uses of the word Logos, kind of this idea of community and discussion and conversation.
Right. No, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think just that that is so embedded within the Western mind that you see it within our justice system, within, I mean, like we're creating a podcast. I mean, this whole idea of then having a dialogue and then somehow reason and logic emerges from the discussion. I mean, this is a very Christian idea. And I mean, not obviously not necessarily because the Logos theology preexisted Christianity, but Christianity tried to crystallize this and really articulate it as a thing of worship, which is unique. I mean, I think so. I mean, I mentioned in kind of the intro video to this channel that all these religious traditions have a central focus, and whether it be the submission to God in Islam, or non-attachment mindfulness in Buddhism, or upholding the law in Judaism, or puja and devotion in Hinduism, going with the way in Taoism. But Christianity has this idea of a divine human. I mean, this is also in Hinduism. You have avatars and stuff, but God as human, but God as Logos, and so then God as human is the incarnation of Logos, and Logos is how He created the world, you know, speaking it into existence. And then for me, that connects then with these theories of magic and ritual. And I think it's so interesting when I talk to people, whether they be in the psychedelic community or just spiritual, how they believe magic is real, but then they don't understand how, if magic is real, then these other understandings of language and Logos, then that has to be real, right? Not necessarily you have to be Christian or anything like that, but you have to recognize that somehow language is this supernatural power that humans have, which essentially make us human, differentiate us from animals, but also allow us to affect the world. And anyways, yeah, that's kind of what I think about that. Do you want to let's try to transition the conversation into your specific research with Gregory and Wittgenstein, and maybe one of your most recent papers on how your approach was, what you saw, and the overlaps between the two.
Yeah, I'll tell you one of the papers I wrote recently that I think touched on this, and whether or not I was right in the paper, is certainly debatable. But something that I found very interesting, especially trying to come at them as a historian, as well as a Christian, I looked at both of their biographies, and reading on their biographies and the way that they interacted with their family and with their work and with themselves, I noticed something, and that was that both Gregory of Nysa and Ludwig Wittgenstein were extremely insecure. They actually, we think especially of Wittgenstein as being like this brash, almost rude, domineering personality. But one anecdote I think is very revealing. He had an older brother, and his older brother not only mastered the piano by the age of 4, but by the age of 6 was composing his own music. Wittgenstein, by contrast, Ludwig Wittgenstein, of course, since now we're talking about his brother, he didn't learn to speak until he was 4. So he's coming from this huge family of geniuses, his dad being one of the richest men in Vienna at the time, and then his sister being an intellectual powerhouse herself, who was actually very close friends with Sigmund Freud. So Ludwig is coming out of this family of overachievers. And here he comes along, a younger child, generally thought of as the slowest of the bunch in his family. And yet he goes on to become arguably the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. So why is that? Well, in some ways, perhaps, and the overlap, I think, with Gregory of Nyssa is when you have that kind of humility, when you have that kind of insecurity, when you come at these questions from that kind of a place, I almost wonder if that doesn't give you a greater sensitivity to that which is ineffable, a greater sensitivity to the fact that some things will transcend language and logic. And so, and then of course, Gregory of Nyssa, in a lot of ways, had a very similar biography. A lot of people will be more familiar with the fact that he was the younger brother of the aptly titled Basil the Great. And so he's living in the shadow of a very, very prominent older brother who is not only a very, very important thinker, but is an organizer and a leader. Gregory became Bishop of Nyssa because his older brother put him there. We should be really specific about that. He did not become the Bishop of Nyssa based solely upon his merits. He was placed there by his older brother. And then, like Wittgenstein, Gregory of Nyssa had an older sister, Macrina, and she also was something, well, not something of, was clearly a spiritual director. And whether it's another example of his humility or it's true, makes no difference to the argument. Gregory of Nyssa called her his intellectual better. And so, as in a matter of fact, he wrote a book wherein he is the blubbering fool, and his sister Macrina is the wise, educated teacher who is in control of her passions, while Gregory of Nyssa is a mess. And then a lot of scholars have pointed out that this actually reflects a Socratic dialogue, with Gregory of Nyssa writing himself as the fool and writing his sister as the Socratic figure. So I saw biographies, and it made for interesting conjecture as to whether or not the fact that they had this humility, even insecurity, maybe differentiated them from others in the way that they approached the transcendent.
Right. No, that's really fascinating. It's almost like an archetypal overlap, and then they both have this Sophia figure. Essentially, they're sisters in both cases, which is again really really interesting. So, how did Gregory understand the logos? What when he says logos, what did that mean for Gregory as opposed to Maximus the Confessor and all these different people? How did Gregory understand that particularly?
Yeah, I think one of Gregory's most important contributions in this is by specifically putting the logos with God's energies, and then participating in God's essence. And of course, this is during the Trinitarian controversy. So we have to be very, very specific and precise with our language, because they were really struggling to understand how this logos, the second person, was related to the Father. And of course, without getting into Nicene doctrines, I think one of the important things for Gregory is to say that God, in his essence, is unknowable. But then God generates energies and activities, and the Logos is fundamental in this generation. And those are the things, these energies and activities, that's where humanity can understand, recognize, and commune with God in those energies. And so, like you were saying with the burning bush, that's a prime example of God, not in his essence, but more in his activities, revealing himself to Moses in the desert. Wherein God's essence is still unknowable, still in that ineffable realm.
And that the essence, just for some people may already be aware of this, but essa and essentia, this comes from Aristotelian and Greek philosophy on just philosophical understandings of what is. And so then Christianity kind of picked that up and then used essa and essentia and its articulation of God and Christologies and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, of course, that is a huge part of Logos theology that does bear mentioning, of course, and that is, how is this Logos? How is it related to God the Father? Is it exactly the same? Is it generated from the Father? Is it projected out, begotten? And that's why that first verse in John chapter 1 is just, it's just all over the place. But it's because humans are constantly trying to come to an understanding of exactly how does God and his Logos cooperate. What's the relationship there? And that's going to be very important in this Trinitarian controversy, but then it's going to get played out even further in the Christological controversies as well.
And so for some of the listeners, when you're talking about this Trinitarian controversy, essentially what you're talking about is the Council of Nicaea, and then what's called the Filioque, and this is the split between the Eastern Orthodox and what we know as Catholicism, the Western Church. And essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was that, again, it had to do with the second person of the Trinity and its relation to the Holy Spirit, because from the Eastern Orthodox perspective, they understood the Trinity as more like a triangle. God's at the top, and then you have the Son, and you have the Holy Spirit. Whereas the Western interpretation was more that it's almost like a triangle upside down, that there's God, and then there's the Son, and then there's the Holy Spirit that kind of is doing the work of both of them. So could you speak on that just quickly?
Yeah, and what I would cite my source on this first before I spoke about it, and I would really encourage people that are interested in this topic to read Vladimir Lossky's The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, and he lays out a lot of these issues. In essence, what he says, and I'm not pretending to understand or grasp exactly how this all works, but his contention in that book is essentially that, like we talked about with Gregory of Nysa, the Eastern Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, essentially begins with the energies, which in this case would be the three persons of the Trinity, and work from the persons up to the essence. So essentially, sort of like you were saying with the triangle example, we're starting with the individual, we're starting with the persons, the three persons, and then from them we go up to an understanding of their unity in substance, in the way that they share in one essence. The Western understanding does it in the reverse manner, and they begin with essentially God's nature, and beginning with the unified nature, we then come down and try to understand how the unified nature becomes three persons. And by working in that direction, starting with unity and coming down into plurality, that's when we start saying, okay, now the Holy Spirit is generated from both the Father and the Son. Whereas starting from the persons and working up towards the substance, we see a more unified chain coming down. So then we have God the Father's essence producing both the Son and the Holy Spirit out of the one essence of God. And again, I'm not in any way pretending to understand that, and that's why I would refer people to Lossky. But that's his understanding, and that's the best, as far as I've ever found, that's the best explanation of why the big split.
And yeah, and that's essential in understanding the differentiation between Eastern and Catholicism. And it's interesting that a lot of people just aren't familiar with Eastern Orthodox and what they believe and what exactly is going on there. And it wasn't, myself included, it wasn't until I took a course here at the GTU on Eastern Orthodox, and at the time I was a little bit less sympathetic to Christianity. I mean, now I identify as a Christian, but at the time I was much more interested in, analytical philosophy, secular ideas. and that opened me up to this logos theology, and then how taking that structure you can symbolically understand reality from it and understand the unfolding of being, and that really kind of opened my eyes, because it's not the passion orientation that you find in Catholicism. I mean, Catholicism is really focused on the passion of Christ and the crucifixion, whereas it seemed to me, from my experience with Eastern Orthodox, it's more about the resurrection and the eternality of the Logos, about the Word and this type of thing. I mean, do you have anything to say regarding that?
Well, I would want to say one thing. Well, there's lots of things that I want to say about that, naturally. The one thing I would want to say just before I forget, though, I would nuance one thing you said, and that is specifically because of this logos theology and its more influence in the Greek Orthodox Church. For them, they don't they don't emphasize to as much an extent the death and the resurrection. Although, of course, those things are important in the Orthodox Church. Please don't get me wrong. But for them, the emphasis is in incarnation. It's when the divine logos becomes human and takes on not just human flesh, but all of humanity. That is the decisive factor. Even in what we would call salvation, that's the critical moment when the logos becomes incarnated and that which is incorporeal becomes enfleshed. And so, of course, that's important in Western Christianity as well, but that is de-emphasized in comparison to the death and resurrection. And so, again, we have not a difference of opinion necessarily, but rather it's a difference of emphasis. And the difference in emphasis, the emphasis on the incarnation, is because of this, the importance in Greek Orthodox theology. The second thing that I would want to say that you brought up that I think is a profound understanding, and that is in the Western Church, I feel that there's something of a dichotomy between reason and spirituality, or between rational understandings and mysticism. And this artificial dichotomy, I feel like is handled better in the Orthodox Church.
I agree.
And we really see, even though obviously they have this understanding that God transcends the rational, and that the logic we experience here can be subsumed by a greater divine logic, and that is essentially the mystical union. Even though we have all those ideas clearly present in the Orthodox Church and in patristic theology, at the same time, the two are always joined as one and not split apart. And so we utilize our reason in order to transcend it and go past it into the mystical union. So rather than this kind of false split that we see a little bit more predominantly in the Western Church, the Orthodox Church has a much more unified understanding of intellect and mysticism, in my opinion.
No, I would second that notion. And one of the things that I find powerful too is the emphasis on the incarnation of the Logos. In John, it talks about, Jesus says, "Have I not said, ye are gods, and you will do greater works than I?" Well, once you try to, again, think about this thing symbolically through a theological lens, is okay, so the Logos, you have to go through the Logos to get to the Father. And then Jesus, the Logos, is telling you, you will do works like myself, and therefore the incarnation of the Logos is still occurring through all of us. It's an unfolding phenomenon. It's not, and this is kind of my beef with Protestantism, which I grew up in. It's like, I love the plurality of Protestantism, and I love the lack of these rigid ecclesiastical structures. But it's so fixed on these literal historical interpretations. It doesn't really truly appreciate these mystical interpretations of how, the logos is still acting through us. And one of the things that I think is just speaking the truth, just like in your regular day speech, just like not lying, whether you're correct or incorrect. You may be factually incorrect in something, but as long as you're not lying, like I almost see that as a theological process, a sort of devotion in itself to the process of language, to the process of expression, and the logos in your utilization of language itself. How are you using it? And when you're deceiving or lying about things, I mean, to me, what immediately comes to mind is like the mainstream media, and like how many people don't believe most of the things that they see out of the mainstream media, because it's so full of lies, and it doesn't resonate with people, yet it's broadcasted on everybody's TV inside their homes. Google and YouTube and Facebook are censoring alternative media sources because they contradict these larger narratives. And again, from a symbolic understanding, I see that all again within this lens of the logos, of language, of God being truth. So true things are divine. It is God. And so for me, then, when I read this stuff, it's not like I'm reading about something that happened. I'm reading about these symbolic understandings, these philosophical, theological understandings of how the world is actually put together. And language itself is divine. It's this commonality between man and God himself. And then within that, reason and logic. I mean, these are things that man has that the animals don't, but also that within these theological interpretations, God has. So I just find it really powerful for people to look at their lives that way. And it's not necessarily you have to be Christian to just think that, like my point to people who believe in magic. I mean, if you believe in magic, then you believe language literally can affect the world. Well, then how do you do that? And then, like, if you're following truth, to me, that's part of this larger thing, like even within the Lord's Prayer about, doing God's will in heaven here on earth. If you're trying to follow truth, theologically, I think you could understand that as you're following God's will, because God is true. Whereas when you're lying, when you're deceiving, like that's part of man's will, because what is the reason for your lie? And that's for you, your own will to attain something else or to deceive somebody so you can get something. Do you have anything about that? Or I was going to kind of ask you about Wittgenstein.
No, actually, of course, you made so many fabulous points. It's almost hard for me to pick which one I want to zone in on. I guess probably for the sake of the conversation, the most important thing for me to zone in on is the one point of contention or disagreement that I might have with what you said. And of course, I think what we're all struggling with is this fact and truth, and what is the difference between the two. And this is going to cut to the heart of a metaphorical reading of the Bible versus a more literal reading. And the trouble is, I mean, the rub, the difficulty is, where do we find truth? Is it in fact, or is there something that is beyond fact that is more true than simple facts? Like an example I heard recently that I thought was brilliant. He said, I ate oatmeal for breakfast. And that is a very, very factual statement. But what kind of truth is in it? Is Hamlet more true than the fact that I ate breakfast, even though it's completely fiction? Right? There's no fact in Hamlet, but there's a great deal of truth.
Right.
Whereas there's a huge amount of fact in what I ate for breakfast, but very, very little truth. So then we come down to, but where does that work within a historical narrative, which a lot of the scriptures are, or at least purport to be? So you say, well, can it be true without being factual, or does it have to be factual because it's being proclaimed as a historical narrative? And of course, I think that in essence, my opinion is there has to be some kind of basis in fact for there to be full truth. And I think that's where the historicity of at least the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus does become critical. That those are in some way, factual, so that they can be like the full truth, completely true, because they also possess the depth and importance of a Hamlet, but then they also have the factual basis in reality as well. And so, but the way that truth and fact work together is something that we all, struggling with.
Right. No, and I mean, philosophy itself is dealing with that. And some of the listeners may be familiar with the Sam Harris podcast where he had Jordan Peterson on, and this was the exact conversation, this roadblock they got into because they were talking about truth, and Jordan Peterson was trying to articulate these archetypal, these embedded structures of meaning within reality, and Sam Harris was just interested in, empirical fact as truth. And so this is exactly the conversation they were having, and I would agree with you. So that for me, meaning is more true than fact, and that seems like a bit of a conundrum. And what does that mean? But meaning itself, like things that give purpose to living, things that drive you to do things. Like the only reason you do things is because something is meaningful. It's not because it's a fact. And so meaning itself, in regard to this hierarchy of like truth, fact, meaning, like meaning should be right there at the top of this hierarchy because it drives action and it drives societies. I mean, all societies are kind of orchestrated around some type of transcendent ideology, call it religion. So why are those the motivating force that moves societies forward? It's because within it contains all this meaning about life and lived experience. And some of the listeners are going to be familiar with Terence McKenna, and he was kind of a psychedelic scholar and renegade in certain circumstances, but he was all about the lived experience and like do not believe things necessarily, but appreciate your lived experience and try to understand the world through that, because that's like a prism that is outside ideology to a degree. Although obviously we interpret our lived experience through ideologies, but again, that's where you find meaning, like love, like having kids, like you're choosing your career, like that's all has to do with meaning, not fact, and that's what drives life. So I mean, in a sense, I'm totally in agreement with you there.
Yeah, and I do think though, when you start evaluating the meaning or the archetypes, whatever your culture has put as that transcendent driver of what is meaning and what is value, then that to have any lasting power is going to be questioned based against how it actually relates to the facts of your existence.
Right.
So then you always have this. I mean, it's almost in some ways perhaps analogous to the interaction between mind and body. Perhaps it's analogous to the way the incorporeal interacts with the bodily,
right.
Because they're always there and together. Because if your religion or your structure of values or your culture, whatever transcendent meta narrative that is giving meaning to your reality, if it doesn't jive with the facts as you experience them,
right,
well, it's very difficult to hang on to that, right? So in essence, you can't live with that type of cognitive dissonance. At some point, your worldview will have to change to accommodate the facts of your reality.
Yeah, no, that's profound, and I think that's really important, and I agree with that 100%. So can you get now to where you see, because I believe you focus on the tractatus with regards to Wittgenstein, can you get to how you saw his analytical theories of language and how that might overlap with Gregory's theories of the logos?
That's a very, very difficult question, of course, and one that is still in its embryonic stages of research.
Okay.
So don't hold me completely liable for anything that I say. And as I already mentioned, of course, Wittgenstein is a very, very difficult philosopher to grapple with.
Right.
And I think that's part of the reason why he's had such influence, right? People who make pedestrian observations don't generally be proclaimed as the greatest philosopher of the century.
Right.
It's those whose ideas are extremely slippery and difficult and dynamic, of course, over his lifetime. That being said, it does, in essence, the way that I read the Tractatus, which we should mention, of course, there are multiple readings of the Tractatus.
Right.
The one that I utilize is an ineffabilist version of the standard reading. The standard reading being kind of the second in the line. So historically, the Tractatus is originally read in a positivist sense. And based on the work that Wittgenstein did after the Tractatus, and based on new information about his life and thought, and the positivist reading is in most respects untenable today.
Mm-hmm.
And then along comes the more standard, generally led by PMS Hacker and iView. So here's kind of the nitty gritty nuts and bolts. Wittgenstein says very clearly how logic and language interact in a perfect language structure, and how those can create propositions which correspond perfectly to the physical reality we experience every day. However, we don't live in just that perfect reality. And there is something that goes beyond what our language can say. Truth, perhaps this is one way of saying it, truth that is not propositional. And Wittgenstein very clearly says this is the transcendental or the mystical. Two words that in some ways he uses almost interchangeably. Mm-hmm. In fact, in an interesting twist, he says that logic itself is transcendental. It goes beyond what we can actually say propositionally about it, because anything we say would be conditioned by logic, and now all of a sudden we're in an obvious vicious circle. Mm-hmm. And so what he does is, by describing how language functions within logic to create propositions to describe reality, he then delimits that reality and says, okay, but there are things outside of this which include logic, religion, aesthetics, and ethics. All of those things lie beyond what we can say clearly about them. And of course, then he culminates with, about those things, then, we must remain silent. He goes on through the rest of his life to say many, many things about these things. So he doesn't actually stay entirely true to this Tractatus ideal. But the culmination is that which we cannot speak about, thereof we must be silent.
Right.
As I say, he did, in fact, a whole series. In fact, I have the book right here, by a stroke of luck / genius. An entire book on lectures and conversations on aesthetics, psychology, and religious belief that Wittgenstein delivered.
Now, wasn't his family Jewish?
I'm sorry?
Was his family Jewish?
That's also a long and complicated history. Yes, but they converted to Catholicism about 2 generations before Ludwig.
Oh, okay.
So, in fact, Wittgenstein is his German name, and they had his great grandfather was named Moses Meyer, I believe, and then they took the name Wittgenstein under Napoleon. It's a very long and complex history that I shouldn't be speaking on, to be honest with you.
Gotcha.
But they were ethnically Jewish, but culturally they were Austrian, and then religiously they were Catholic. Yes, there you go.
So this ineffability I find really interesting because Christian mysticism is all about, or a lot of it is about contemplation. So there's only so much we can say, and then to get further divine experience, divine knowledge. I mean, the whole monastic tradition is about sitting in silence and contemplating, and so philosophically, it's like that's how they get around the ineffable, right? The manifestation of corporeal things that are divine. Because to transcend the persons, you have to get at the non-corporeal, the incorporeal.
Yeah, and I would take it even a step further, and that's why to me, language is kind of the jumping off place. But then for the mystical tradition, we go beyond language, and then we go beyond logic, and then we go beyond reason ourselves, and then we go beyond existence until we're all the way at being.
Right.
So and of course we kind of already touched on it, but yeah, the whole idea of how language and then our own reason and rationality interact becomes a sticky question. And for most of the Christian thinkers, yes, our reason is conditioned by our language, and that's why both have to be transcended in order to get in touch with God's essence.
So I was going to ask you about like human nature, because that's a huge part of this theological understanding too, is that the corporeal world is how would you say, that from the traditional Christian understanding, I mean, the Gnostics, believe that essentially the corporeal world was evil to a degree because it was an emanation from the demiurge. But I mean, even in John, in the Gospels, Jesus talks about how this, the difference between this world and the world beyond. And I think that's another unique aspect about Christianity is giving Caesar what is Caesar's, and why. I mean, you could argue the Catholic tradition, but the separation of church and state, I mean, that's a unique aspect in world religions. And that occurs particularly explicitly within Protestantism, but particularly within Christianity. And I think you can already see that from the theologies, from the theology, and then the whole God becoming an individual. We get the individualism, which again is unique to Western civilization, and just these collectivistic ideologies, whether it be communism, socialism, these larger totalitarian structures. There's a reason why, it's not, they didn't emerge necessarily. I mean, philosophically, you get Marx and all this stuff, but they didn't emerge within the Christian tradition. Within these atheistic traditions is where you get these larger understandings, and then from the theological understanding, you can get that with God's or human will, as opposed to this more divine will, where I mean, I was thinking about this the other day about central planning in governments, and how from this, taking these symbolic understandings, that central planning is this really narcissistic understanding that a group of people, essentially bureaucrats and elected officials, can choose the destiny of other people, whereas this separation, like capitalism, the more pluralistic of industry, where God, again, like God's own will can start to manipulate the world into a better form. I know that's a lot. I was just kind of spewed out, but it was something that I was really contemplating yesterday. I sat for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, just really thinking about the difference between like allowing the plurality of society versus like central planning, and how that almost is like a theological understanding of the world.
No, it's an excellent point. One, of course, that is entirely over my head. I would maybe, the thing that I would probably mention is, of course, when it comes to Christianity and the government, we have a long and varied history. And so when we start out, especially in the early patristic era, we have a very unique view of Christianity's role within the government. You have what was a government that was ambivalent, if not openly hostile to the religion for at least a few centuries. And so during that time, of course, a whole theology developed of what do we, as people who are dedicated to our religion and to the person of Jesus Christ, how do we operate and function in society? And interestingly, for the longest time, they made a compelling argument that their role in society was prayer. And they could actually affect through their prayer and their worship of the one true God. And so that was far better, in their opinion, than sacrificing to the emperor or serving in the army or doing a number of things that we would consider to be part of our civic duties.
Right.
But then, of course, all that changes when Constantine rolls on the scene, and we suddenly have the intermingling of Christianity and the government. Right. And so then we have a long period of Constantinian power hangover in the church, in which in a lot of ways we're still trying to recover from today. And so I think a lot of that church state separation we're seeing goes back to those early days.
I agree. Prior
to Constantine. But of course it's a very long and varied history. Including in the East versus the West, which is another important distinction once again.
And again, like symbolically looking at the evolution of Christianity, I see the First Amendment of the United States as like a theological declaration of the logos, of the full freedom of expression itself. So then truth can combat falsity, because this is one of my theological kind of cornerstones that I stand on, is that I do think that if like truth is a threat to false narratives, and the whole crackdown I'm seeing right now by big tech, and again by these larger monopolistic corporations against alternative media sources, is the suppression of free speech, because it's working almost at a theological level. Like truth itself is God. So truthful speech, truthful understanding, it's like combating, tyranny. And that's why then you have the Second Amendment with the guns and all this stuff. But it's all about, even though the founding fathers weren't explicitly theological, most of them were deists, but I just see that ingrained understanding of the freedom of language and truth being central to the prosperity of the United States.
Yeah, you make a compelling argument. I, of course, would wonder. I'd be curious, though, because it seems to me that the fundamental thing there is not necessarily truth, but freedom. Freedom to be wrong, freedom to speak lies, freedom to speak untruths, as well as the freedom to speak truth. Right. So in a lot of ways, I see truth as almost one option within the First Amendment, which really gives you like the whole panoply of options in regards to truth and belief.
Well, it gets to the theological understanding of free will too. So I totally agree that allows for the falsities, allows for lies, but that, just take a historical example. Take the Soviet Union. Take, the whole history of China. These tyrannical structures where if your truth or your whatever is counter to that of state power, it's total suppression and death in most instances. So that's why, for me, being the only country in the world that ever had a First Amendment, you can't separate that from the origins of this logos theology 2,000 years prior.
And yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head right there, because I suppose the difference is within the freedom to speak truth allows you to essentially come to your own understanding of the truth rather than a government constructed truth.
Right.
And that's what the First Amendment is really protecting you from.
Right.
It's protecting you from the government constructing your truth and forcing it down your throat.
Right.
And so I think that theological understanding of free will is critical within that, because what we do is we're saying we have the ability to choose for ourselves what truth we're going to hold on to and what truth we're going to speak.
Absolutely.
So, but no, that's an excellent point. One that's, of course, way over my head and outside of my specialty.
Right, and I'm no specialist either, but I just kind of start rambling. I sit and think about these things, and random topics will get me talking about that. But Clifton, I know you have to get going. Hopefully we can do this again in the future. This has been a great conversation. I'd love to dive in even further, maybe some patristic understandings. Maybe next time we can focus on Gregory and maybe a couple other patristic church fathers, and just dive into maybe the differences, the overlaps in their own theologies and understandings, just to kind of flesh out some of this history. Because this one of the things that I find so interesting from my own journey is diving into this patristic literature and then reading these things as immense sources of wisdom that you can, really understand your own daily life in a new way. Not that you have to, take that they're gospels or anything like that, but I think they're just really helpful and just really diving into this logos and trying to understand the language and the world through a theological understanding of language has been immensely powerful for my own life.
Well, mine as well, and of course that's a big part of the reason not only why I study the Greek patristic fathers, but also why kind of one of my long-term goals is to bring some of their insights into Protestant and evangelical churches, and that's kind of part of my larger goal. I started studying them for my own personal betterment, but now I'm seeing that they do have a depth of wisdom that really needs to be brought into especially Western Protestant churches.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. Well, we will leave it there. And is there any sort of contact information you'd like to leave with the people if they'd like to send you questions or get in touch with you with anything about your work or what you've said here?
Oh, man. Yeah, absolutely. You can hit me up at C Huffmaster, which is just CHuffmaster at ses.gtu.edu.
And
of course, my school email address.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and edit this video, so while you were saying that, I'll have your email then underneath you on the screen so people can visually see that.
Perfect, because of course I was not prepared, but that would be great.
Yeah, so that way if anybody really wants to ask Clifton any more questions about his work or his own ideas, you can reach him there. And
and I would absolutely welcome any emails. Obviously conversation is a big part of what I'm trying to do. So any questions, comments, or concerns, I would welcome.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And for those listening, please like, share, and subscribe. Like this video, share it with your friends, share it with your community, see what other people kind of think about this. And we look forward to the next conversation. So thank you so much, and God bless.
Absolutely. Thank you, Patrick.